Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. My name is Matt McClarty. I'm the Vice President of the API Academy at CA Technologies. The purpose of this presentation is really to give you some tips on how to get started building a sustainable and successful API program. More than just an API program, but a program that will help you take advantage of APIs. As you'll see, there's a lot of intersecting points. The theme and title is API360, and this is something that we've been talking about in the API Academy over the last several months. The reason that we call it 360 is that we found that a real holistic approach is required when you're working with APIs. You need to be able to cover the full spectrum of strategy, business, organizational aspects, architecture, and technology. All of these things need to be considered and factored in to make sure that you get success, to get the success that you want. I'm going to give the whole presentation, and at the end we'll do Q&A, but in the meantime, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them at the end. There's a lot of information to cover, so I don't want you to forget your questions before we get there. And before I jump into the presentation, I just want to tell you about another API 360. We've been running this summit series for the last few months. We've done previous events in Washington, D.C. and London, England. Our third API 360 summit will take place in Dallas, Texas on February 26th, so in a couple of weeks. And this is an event where we'll be able to cover the full spectrum of API topics. We start in the morning talking about business things like emergence of the Internet of Things, how it's going to affect multiple industries, as well as just considerations across industries like retail, communications, healthcare, financial services, energy. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be drilling down on architecture and design topics. And we'll have our featured speaker, Eric Knipp from Gartner, who will be giving a presentation on how to build a successful API program. We've got a great couple of panels featuring in the morning a business panel with panelists from GE Healthcare and iHeartMedia and some of the other companies that we're working with. As well as in the afternoon, we've got some of the leading API design experts in the world, members of our own API Academy, as well as authors of popular API books, where we'll get a chance to really look at the state of the art of API design. So it's a full day. It's very interactive, and the admission is free. So just follow the link here to register, and we hope to see you there. But now let's jump into our presentation for today. So let's start right at the basics, right? Why are we even here talking about this? What is a web API? I mean, as a technical definition, it's just a network addressable interface that allows you to, fill in the blank, right? State transfer of data representations is a very RESTful view of it, but it's just the way that systems to connect to other systems over the web. This was really a model that was described most completely in Roy Fielding's dissertation in 2000. And even as early as 2001, if you see the little box there, you'll note that the browserless web was this concept that was already gaining popularity at that time. So pretty early in the web world, certainly early if we think about web APIs. And, if I encourage you to go check out that link there and look at that whole article. It's pretty fascinating to see what people were talking about 14 years ago being very similar to what people are approaching now. So, what's the big deal? What is the big deal with APIs? Why is there so much buzz and hype around APIs? Well, really the reason that there's so much interest is because in that time, or in the time that the web has gone mainstream, where we've gone from this obscure concept of the information superhighway, let's say 20 years ago, to it being a central part of everyone's lives now, the fact is that a whole bunch of the world's biggest companies and most recognizable brands emerged. Amazon, Google, Salesforce, Facebook, more recently Netflix and Uber. All of these companies have started from zero and gone to biggest company status. And And I think that what ties them all together, not only were they dominant and got their start on the browser-based web, but they actually were early adopters of web APIs. We're going to talk quite a bit more about Amazon. Google has APIs all over the place. I would say that the Maps API, the Google search itself behaves quite a bit like a RESTful API. But if you look at Google Maps and the way it's been embedded across so many different systems and platforms, it's a great story around monetization of APIs. Salesforce.com could claim to be the first company to offer a commercial web API. And this was essential, right? If you look at what Salesforce does for CRM, and that's where they got their start, it was one thing to offer a great CRM system on the web and have people get interested in that. It's another thing to then sell that as a solution to large-scale enterprises who already had existing CRM systems. So a fundamental part of the success of Salesforce was the ability to go in and offer a web API that could connect to the existing systems, allow for coexistence, and allow for transition so that you could move the data off the existing platform onto the Salesforce cloud-based platform. Facebook, we all know, as Facebook has become a more of a landing page for people or the first place they go on the web, this has been possible because of Facebook's omnipresence on the web. When you go to web pages, being able to like and share things on Facebook through other people's pages, that's all done through web APIs. Now, Netflix is an example of a company that, I think I've seen stats where there's double-digit percentages of the web's traffic is now going through Netflix. Obviously, depends how you measure it. With streaming content, there's going to be a lot of data volume passed. But the fact is that with the multiple platforms that are available for Netflix, the bulk of that traffic is API traffic. And Uber more recently launched their public API, but they represent a similar vein in a different industry of being very data-oriented. And, I call these companies the data-enabled disruptors. So much of what they do differently than the companies in the industries before them is based on the way that they collect and use data. And the way that they collect and use data, of course, is through web APIs. So, if you think about the business value of APIs, right, it's not about having an API, right? It's about what the API enables, right? Whenever we hear terms like the business of APIs or the API economy, I mean, really, we're just talking about business and economics, right? I mean, APIs are a phenomenal enabler. They really do warrant close consideration, but in order to be successful, right, they need to be considered not standalone. You can't just look at APIs on their own. You have to think about what it is they're enabling. What is the value that's coming out of them? So with that in mind, recognizing that you can have a very simplistic definition of APIs and be done if you want to, really what happened is APIs have kind of been a tagline or a tag acronym for this bigger model of connecting systems, about what has happened with mobile and cloud and the fact that now the interconnectedness of systems is enabling these data disruptors to exist and thrive. We, in 2012, recognized that as a product company, we were Layer 7 at the time, obviously been acquired by CA and grown significantly as a business. But with our expertise around products, we'd worked on a lot of implementations and worked with companies who were doing these types of API-based integrations. We recognized that it was very important to have solid technology knowledge around the space, but also we needed to be able to provide insight into what was making these companies successful with APIs. What were the patterns? What were the best practices that we were observing? And we had gained quite a bit of that, but we also knew that there were other experts in the industry who were exclusively focused on APIs and the areas of strategy, design, and architecture. So we formed the API Academy in 2012, and it's grown since then, and we've been working with many companies around the world on their strategies, initiatives, programs, ever since. So, some of the questions that we get frequently we get a lot of questions, but to boil it down, we get a lot of companies just saying straight up, how can we be more like Amazon, Google, Salesforce, and the other data-enabled disruptors, right? But it's not enough to say, you can't just say, take the blueprint of these West Coast startup companies and apply it to a bank that's been in existence for over 100 years, or a telecommunications company that has a massive user base and a massive vital infrastructure, right? There really becomes an optimization exercise to say, what are the lessons that we can learn from those, and then how can we apply it into a mature and established enterprise? So that's really what we're aiming to solve here with a new model that we call API360. And what we want to do here, this is not a prescriptive model. This is not, there's so much ground to cover here. I can't just give you a script and say, go and do this and you're done, right? What we need to do is really break down the space and try and analyze the different areas that are important, look at the commonalities, and even look at the sequence of how we should view these things. And so I'm going to go through 4 categories of considerations, and I'm going to approach them in what I think is a sensible sequence. So we start with alignment and usefulness. This is really about strategy. Next up, we look at engagement and usability. This is, again, business-oriented but more tactical in nature as we look at how to get started on an API program. Third is scalability and evolvability. This is really the domain of architecture. And finally, manageability and security. This one's more operational in nature and more technologically oriented. So let's start with alignment and usefulness. Because defining a clear set of business goals is the front and center piece of working with an API strategy. So a couple points. What do we mean by alignment and usefulness? Well, really it means that a company's APIs should align with its business goals. And the company's APIs, they need to align internally with the business goals, but they also need to be useful to somebody or some target audience that's going to drive those business goals. Both of these seem very simple, but they're both key, and sometimes they can work against each other, right? I mean, you have to make sure that you're lined up with business goals. What does this mean? Well, you could be a manufacturer of retail goods that need to launch an open API in order to create new channels for revenue. It could mean that you're a media content provider and you want to extend your reach and use your distribution partners to do this. It could mean that you're a financial institution and you're looking for cost reduction targets and you want to meet this through the reuse of enterprise services. All of these are situations where APIs can help meet the business goals. So, I think I don't like to be negative, but I want to address something right off the top, which is what I'll call strategy anti-patterns. And the reason I want to hit this one up is because they're out there, and we encounter them frequently, and it's not that these anti-patterns are completely wrong, it's just that they're, in most cases, incomplete. So first of all is, anyone who's been reading the hype around the API economy, you've probably seen this concept that, if you build an open API and take your data assets and just expose them on the web, that these mythical developers will appear and pay you to use your data and build apps that will drive more usage of your data, which will drive more revenue and so on. Like I said, this is an incomplete picture. I think that you can't take the if you build it, they will come approach. And we're going to talk a lot about why it's so important to define your target audience, target developers, and make sure that they're engaged in adopting the APIs that you use. So yes, in some cases, the long-tail developers that we've heard about, these third-party developers, will exist. But more often than not, you're going to drive the core business of your API usage and through your API with either your own developers or partner developers or a very distinctly defined set of developers. In any case, the remedy here is going to be discussed in the engagement and usability category. Second up in the anti-patterns is what I call service perfectionism. And as an enterprise architect, I can tell you that it is my peers that are guilty on this one, right? A lot of times you start an API program, people will get transfixed on looking internally and thinking about all the data they have and all the services they have and drawing the perfect map that has all the categories and ontologies and everything like that. This is something that gets you into trouble because you can end up in analysis paralysis, right? You don't want to, you'll never be done. If you try and come up with the ultimate enterprise data model or canonical form for your messages, all these things, you will be stuck. Much better to take a more external view, a jobs to be done approach, thinking about the use cases that are going to be important, taking a more iterative approach and saying, okay, maybe draw some high-level boundaries, but then really dive in and find the use cases for APIs that are most important to your target audience that you've defined and go from there. Maybe a little bit similar but different is technological obsession. So we've come across a lot of companies, and believe me, as a product company, we love it when people are interested in the technology platform. But a lot of technologists who may be driving API initiatives skip the business step and go right into thinking about programming languages and frameworks and what are the software components that they're going to be requiring for their APIs, and end up with somewhat of a vacuum. Even if they build a great platform, they don't have a business intention for it. It just looks like a lot of cost with no value in return. I worked with one large enterprise a few years ago who was developing just a fantastic private cloud system that was going to have every availability requirement, very flexible security model, be able to plug into every framework imaginable. And I asked them, they were looking for some architectural guidance around this, okay, so who are the first projects or applications that are going to be using this platform? And there was silence, and I think I offended them. Like, why would I ask such a question? Like, this is the type of thing that will get you into deep cost problems without the return. So, the return, the antidote for that is really get the business requirements on the table first, identify, be pragmatic, identify who are going to be the first projects and applications to use your APIs, and make sure that you're parallelizing the work to stand up the technology with the business work to get users on the system. The last one I'll call tunnel vision, and it's maybe overly negative. It's not really a negative thing at all. The reality is that there are so many places to apply APIs that there's projects going on all over the place, and if you're in an enterprise position, you can't keep track of all of them. But there might be mobile initiatives, and anytime you build a mobile app, unless it's some sort of simplistic video game, you're going to need data from APIs. So there are lots of projects going on, cloud initiatives probably, that will involve APIs that you might not have on your enterprise roadmap. But this is actually not so bad, because as opposed to having zero consumers like the last two categories, at least you have some very tangible, practical cases. So really, the thing to do here, if you identify that there are these projects going on, is get tabs on them, understand what they're doing, and use them as a strong input point to help shape the enterprise API story. Because there's no better feedback and input than the feedback and input that comes from people who are actually on the ground working on real use cases. So now that we've kind of covered some of the things to look out for, just basically keep in mind that when you're doing strategy, you can't do strategy in a vacuum. If you want to have a successful strategy, you have to have the goals that you want to achieve, you have to have a plan to achieve them, and then you have to execute the plan in order to make sure that you achieve them. if you end up in conflict around the strategy and are looking for, you end up in some dogmatic situation, or you're splitting hairs, or there's some friction point, always go back to the goals, right? Always look at the benefits in order to understand. It's usually the tiebreaker, and it serves you well. If you elevate yourself, keep in mind what you're trying to achieve, and then apply that to the situation to make the right decision. So just quickly, I have a whole talk that spends an hour talking about Amazon, but there are some really important lessons that you can see from Amazon in terms of their business approach and how they really are a good case study for alignment and usefulness. If you haven't read this book, it's a very good book, and I was amazed at this book about Amazon that was pretty mainstream. There's a whole chapter that talks about how Amazon adopted APIs as a fundamental part of their business strategy, and actually talking about all the different ways that they've been applied. So a lot of the information I have here is from this book, but has been vetted in other sources as well. But I definitely recommend it as a good learning exercise, and if you're asking that question about how to be more like Amazon and Google and Salesforce. But one of the fundamental pieces of Amazon's success is really this balance of idealism and pragmatism. So going back to some of the things that I just described, right? It's important to have a vision. It's important to have strong goals, stick to them. But that doesn't mean, like in one of the cases I described, you have to figure out the entire worldview before getting started. So, just interestingly, Jeff Bezos had the idea for Amazon was really to be the online retailer selling everything to everyone. Right? That was the original vision. It wasn't as an online bookstore, but that's where the company started out, because it was a very adaptable business model. A small number of suppliers, there was an opportunity in the market, and started there and grew from there. Started providing more and more retail services, and then, as we'll see more in the next slide, got into other industries, adjacent categories, very aggressively, very quickly. But one of the, I think this is a great insight here, was early on, Bezos realized that, the purpose of Amazon wasn't to just provide goods, to be a retailer. It was the differentiating factor for Amazon was that they were able to create the most value when helping customers making purchase decisions. Sorry. And the key to that is data. There was a lot of collection of data, a lot of, originally they had an editorial department that was writing reviews of products, but pretty soon that was overtaken by the amount of crowdsourced input that they could get from their own user community. And that data is really, I think, what differentiates Amazon services, and the ability to use that data in real time and with great purpose. In fact, one of the things with the Amazon approach is that whenever they deliver new functions and features, they're not just looking about what's being delivered at a point in time. They're looking at what is it going to enable for the future as well. So this kind of duality of purpose around delivering new things, deliver it now and also enable the future. And there's this very famous, at least in API circles, one second. At least in API circles, mandate from Bezos, which has only been distributed secondhand from originally from Steve Yegi, who was an engineer at Google, went on a bit of a rant that was supposed to be private and ended up on Google+. But it is also verified in the book. Bezos was talking to Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Publications, and the big proponent of Web 2.0 and big internet innovator. And O'Reilly was complaining, it was hard to get into Amazon services. There'd be a lot of value if there are ways to connecting systems to systems. And that's where the API manifesto came from Bezos, which was basically saying, whenever we build anything, we're going to make sure that data and functionality will only be exposed through APIs. And we have to keep in mind, when we build these, imagine that these are going to be used by external developers who we have very low touch with. So, and then it's been relayed as saying if you don't do this, you'll be fired. That who knows whether or not that was stated, but the point was clear. And from that point on, this has been the approach to building out Amazon functionality and services. And here's the result, right? You start from an online retailer of books, as I said, then got into reselling books in the kind of marketplace, online retailer of anything, adding more goods and services, electronics, and so on, and now pretty much everything is on Amazon, at least in the U.S. You keep going on the book thread, right? Reinvent the book. Okay, now that we've got all this dominance in the book selling market, launch the Kindle, a new way to consume books. And taking the reselling a step further, resell everything, right? The marketplace. And then taking the book concept and extending that to the Kindle Fire tablet platform. And, instead of just reselling anything, you can fulfill anything with Amazon fulfillment. And then if we follow the online retailer thread along, right, you've got a personalized online retailer using the data that's being collected. And then, this gets into identity, which is an area of expansion that Amazon's getting into. And not only being a retailer of anything, but Amazon launched their retail platform, which would allow stores to come and get an online presence easily. And then now they've expanded more into payments and, of course, Amazon Web Services. So this is probably the ultimate case of, if you think about where Amazon started as a retailer of books and where they ended up with a dominant cloud computing platform, there's a lot of steps to get there. How do they do it? Well, by enabling those functions and services and data as APIs, and by targeting it towards kind of external developers in mind, so in other words, making things easy to use and self-service, they were able to pivot very quickly into all these areas. And the story of Amazon Web Services is a very interesting one. I don't have all the time for that, but really, some people think it was to use up the excess server capacity they had. That's actually not true, because Amazon's retail growth was so huge that they kept adding more and more servers to keep up. But it was their ability to, they recognized that through doing all that work to onboard new infrastructure to support their own business, they felt that they had a core competency there that could compete with others in the marketplace, and said, why don't we sell this as a standalone business? And because it was API enabled already in order to support the incredible levels of automation they needed, it was able to be marketed out there and very quickly. And the fact that it was API based, again, made it more iterative, made it more able to collect data, and made it the success that it is today. So a lot to consume there, but suffice to say, Amazon is a terrific study, and lots more information that we can share on that. Okay, so when we're looking, back down to earth for a second, when we're looking at alignment and usefulness, this category, right? What are we going to ask? We're going to look at what are the business goals and how can APIs help achieve them, right? Are there already funded projects that could benefit from APIs? Which ones do you want to get in the pilot stage? How do you ensure that APIs will introduce future value? This is the Amazon concept of when you're looking at delivering APIs, think about what they can do for the future and think about what other possibilities they can unlock. Also, it's very good to look at your industry. Say, what are the gaps in the industry that can be exploited through APIs? Who are the disruptors in your industry? How are they using APIs? I would go a step further and even say, what are some patterns that you're seeing in other industries around APIs that haven't been taken advantage of in your own industry? There's lots of opportunity to take analogies. Like I said before, I mean, if you look at Uber, it's really an application of this platform business model into a new market around ride sharing and taxi services. And of course, what business model does your API enable or extend? Could be that you want to introduce a new business model to support APIs and find new revenue channels there. Chances are, though, that it's more like a force multiplier that you can attach to your APIs. So, in the API Academy, we work, as I said, we work with companies, and these are the typical deliverables that we would focus on, right? Drawing a roadmap of what APIs are going to come in and cross-reference that with projects products, applications that are being introduced. Organizational considerations are important here. We'll talk more about that in the architecture section, but really you need to think about who are all the stakeholders that need to be involved. Business models and business cases, it's very important to address these up front, right? Think about what value you want to create. I mean, value could be as simple as our goal is that we want to open up some of our data as an experiment to see who's going to be interested in some of our assets. That's fine, as long as that's the goal, right? As long as you're not, going to expect $10 million of new revenue in the first 6 months. So we have a new offering we call a strategy assessment that really wraps all those things together and bundles a number of other considerations that we don't have room for with the API Academy that we can help you with there. Okay, moving on to engagement and usability. This is the area where we're very focused on developers. So, there have been a lot of different models and paradigms around integration, systems integration in the past. One of the big ones that sets the web API paradigm apart is that this recognition that developers are extremely important. And, successful API providers have catered to these developers of the client applications that use the APIs. So this recognition is a key and definitely something that is important for anyone attempting to be successful with APIs. So engagement and usability specifically, engagement means that a company should focus on engaging its client consumers, client developers, and that the APIs should be easy for these developers to use. It's that simple, right? So there are different ways of doing that, but these do kind of break down on two different areas. So a good case study here is a company called Twilio. Twilio is a great example. They've invested in both of these areas. So if you haven't heard of Twilio, right, they provide telephony services like voice over IP, SMS, call initiation. And they do this in the context of the mobile app development paradigm. So they actually work with partner providers for all of these services. They're more of a broker, right? They don't have their own network. They need to ride on the carrier networks. But what they do is they define very highly usable services. They provide it in a way that's extremely friendly to developers, and they provide a whole tool set around how to use their APIs. So, they've got a lot of those data-enabled disruptors that we talked about early on, the customers, Salesforce and Uber, couple, also eBay, Airbnb. They also service established companies like Coca-Cola, Home Depot, and Sony. So they're a big player, but they've been in it's a competitive space. But APIs are their primary products, and so they have a very, very conscious product management on their APIs. And like I said, it's a pretty competitive market. If you look, a lot of the early adopters of APIs were telcos, big carrier companies who were looking to take some of the services that they had provided in the web services arena, things like what Twilio provides, and offer them out to the open market. So some of the biggest telecommunications companies in the world were investing a lot in exposing those services. But Twilio was able to survive and thrive even despite that competition. There were a number of reasons for this. First, we can look at the marketing and the first mover advantage, more business aspects, but a big part of their success was really this focus on usability, right? They recognize that developers want to get up and running as quickly as possible. Mobile developers, there's a huge advantage in getting to market quickly, and so they wanted to make sure that they could go and take advantage of that market, and the way to do it is to use APIs that do what they need, that are easy to use, and that have the right tools around them so that they can be up and running quickly. So, lots has been written about the Twilio story. I'm just something to think about here. They actually developed usability metrics, so looking at how how they can understand how usable their APIs are. They're measuring things like developer registrations and activity in their community. And I like this one. They have a time to hello world, where really they're looking at what's the average time it takes for a developer, a new developer, to register for the API, get up to speed on how to use it, and then get their first successful API call. So these are things any enterprise can think about, so that you can really understand how usable your APIs are, and make sure that this is a key area that you're considering when you're designing and developing APIs. So here are some more questions around this category, right? Who are the intended and expected consumers of your APIs, right? Really important to define who your audience is, right? And who are the developers that are going to be building those client applications? How do you attract and retain the right consumers and developers, right? It's not just enough, as I said before, you don't just want everybody signing up, right? You want the consumers to sign up that are going to align with your business goals, again, going back to the first category, right? How do you factor in the needs of the consumers into your API design? So how do you get the feedback loop set up so that you're servicing their needs at the same time as you're driving your business goals, right? How do you enhance the developer experience for the API? Right? Developer experience, DX, this is a bit of a buzz term. It's a big research area for Ronnie Mitra from the API Academy, but it's very important because I think because developer experience has been fundamental to the success of the API paradigm, it's something that you need to pay attention to. And lastly, which is a pretty big category, what tools does the developer community need in order to help make them use your API, be successful with your API, and drive the right adoption for what you want? So again, all areas of primary concern. And again, in terms of deliverables around the engagement and usability, developer program. Now this is something that we've worked with companies on. We also have an excellent partner, WIP, the Wireless Industry Partnership. You go to whip.org, who is, this is their core focus around helping companies define developer strategies, developer programs, and take you right from that audience definition through to all of the activities like communication and hackathons and so on that help you build that audience. Developing your own set of API and developer experience principles are quite important. And consumer toolkits, really. This is the toolkits that you would provide out to your partner developers or even your own developers to help build applications that use your APIs, make it as easy as possible. And in the API Academy, probably our most popular engagement is through either workshops or boot camps. And the workshop is a one-day event, which is more lecture style, where we go through a number of key architectural design topics. The boot camp is more intensive and is more like 3 to 5 days, where we come in and work with you on all of these different categories, but we actually apply it to your in-flight API work, so that if you have APIs that are in flight and you're looking at how you can design them and what are the architectural considerations, we can come in with a boot camp, work actively on those APIs, and at the end of the boot camp, not only will you have learned the best practices around these areas, but you'll also been able to apply it to those API work that you already have in flight. So in terms of design topics that address the engagement and usability category, here is just some samples, right? Principles of API design, improving adoption through DX, designing APIs and SDKs for the different user communities, and then even around building effective teams so that you can make sure that you're engaging in the right way. So, once you have the business strategy and the developer management stuff covered, which you did in the last two categories, right, you're on your way. You've got a good start to your API program. But the problem is that you can get a good start, but how do you sustain it, right? To build momentum and to be able to handle the momentum if you are successful, you need to make sure that your APIs are scalable and evolvable. Scalability and evolvability really means that APIs, and when I say APIs, this is really everything surrounding them, should be able to shrink and grow with the business, right? It's not just about scaling up to the maximum, right? It's about right-sizing the APIs, the API infrastructure, the flexibility in order to make sure it fits the business model. And then around evolvability, right, you need to be able to change and adapt over time, right? If you're, if you're facing, you want to be able to make sure that you're not introducing obstacles that are going to kill you down the road, and you have to face the fact that sometimes obstacles pop up, and you have to figure out how to blow them up and keep going, right? And really, this is what I consider the realm of true enterprise architecture. So I'm going to be a bit opinionated here and say, good enterprise architecture is definitely needed to be successful with APIs, right? And what does that mean? Well, in my opinion, good architecture means that you need to be looking at the long term. You need to be focusing on the horizon, right? Not just hair splitting in the present time. You need to be thinking about what's coming down the road. You need to be able to synthesize multiple perspectives, right? You need to make sure that you're thinking about business goals and organizational constraints and institutions within your company and trends within your industry in order to come up with the right decisions that are not going to limit your growth or flexibility. And then third, you need to make sure that you impose appropriate constraints. You go back to the Fielding dissertation I mentioned, phenomenal definition of integration across network-based computing. It also is a great description of what's important with architecture, and he's always talking about constraints. So this means that you can't dictate everything in your enterprise, but you need to put in the right constraints that are going to guide people in the right direction. So things to avoid with good architecture is you don't want to obsess about standardization, right? You don't want to get into trying to be so constraining that you don't give any people anywhere to move. And the more you define things, the more likely that you're going to be impacted by change as well. Also, going back to one of the anti-patterns from strategy, don't only care about technology, right? You have to have all those multiple perspectives I talked about. And don't favor the model over reality. I think I'm going to talk a bit about that now. But I find we've come into contact with so many companies now who are obsessing over trying to fit into some model which is just an abstraction of some good things that some companies did. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are, I think, well, maybe before I go into the models, I'll digress for a second. I know this is like Matt's book club here, but I just read this book recently. It's a pretty exhaustive book called Why Nations Fail, talking about how do sovereign nations, what makes them succeed or fail, what are the different socioeconomic factors, talks about things like inclusive and exclusive institutions, creative destruction as a necessary force, virtuous versus vicious cycles. Good alliteration there. But it really boils down to, if you want to be successful as a country, you need to have inclusive institutions. You need to foster creative destruction, which means being willing to tear down the existing power structure in order to make room for a better one. And you need to empower your citizenry. I mean, this really translates well to enterprise initiatives, right? Make sure that all stakeholder groups are involved, right? When you're looking at a choice between achieving your business goals or protecting the past, choose the goals, and make sure that you give all stakeholders a voice. So, just a brief tangent to point out that some of the things I'm talking about are actually vetted out on a large global economic scale. But going back to models for a minute, there are three models that we seem to be running up against a lot when it comes to APIs. There's the old, which is SOA, service-oriented architecture. There's the current, which is APIs, and then there's this future one which is just emerging now called microservices or microservice architecture. Now, when I talked about model versus reality, a lot of people are spending a lot of time trying to come up with a perfect definition of what are microservices, or they're coming up, they're having endless debates about the differences between SOA and APIs. This is a perfect opportunity to say, hold it a minute, what are these things? It's not like somebody went into a forest and picked some fruit off the SOA tree, right? These are attempts at abstracting a set of principles that worked in a set of real-life case studies, and maybe to put this to the test, you look at SOA and APIs, I would argue that Amazon is probably, one of the top case studies for both SOA and APIs. So really, maintaining a goal focus is important. And if we just, very simplistically boil down these things, and without getting into the weeds, SOA introduced the concept that if you decompose systems into reusable services, it will help you be more agile and probably save you cost by, economies of scale. That's good. APIs took that same concept but took it to a new level by saying, let's really understand who's using this, who are the developers using the APIs, cater to that community, make it as easy as possible in order to drive higher adoption rates, right? That was new, and that's been very effective and a differentiator over the way things were being done in what we call the SOA world. Now we've got microservices, which comes at the same territory from a bit of a different perspective. There's a lot of different perspectives, hard to nail down, but fundamental difference, in my opinion, is that the microservices camp are coming from this DevOps continuous delivery mentality and saying, whereas in the past people were resistant to change, didn't want to introduce change in their infrastructure, we want to be really good at change, and we want to be prepared and accept that things will fail. So let's build our systems and be service-oriented and use APIs, but build them in a way so that we can be prepared for lots of change and be resilient in case of failure. Another new perspective. But these things can all go together harmoniously. And the most important thing to consider, if you're ever struggling with the debate between all these different models for enterprise integration, is to just step away, take a deep breath, and think about what it is you're trying to achieve. What are the goals you want? Chances are that will help to guide your thinking, and you'll realize that debating abstract models is dogmatic and unnecessary, and what you really need to do is look for the principles that are either common or distinct and apply those. So, okay, I'll come back now to a more practical area and look at things that you need to consider around scalability and evolvability, right? So you have to think about the design time scalability of your APIs, right? What's going to affect things at design time? How do you make sure that as you develop APIs and service the developers who are building apps that use your APIs, that you're servicing their needs at design time? Of course, you need to also think about it at runtime. How are you going to deal with spikes? How are you going to deal with the different ebbs and flows of traffic that's happening? Versioning of APIs, right? How do you deal with versioning? What happens if everybody's using your old version and you need to introduce some new data fields, or things need to change and you need to extend the model? How do you deal with that? Technology trends, you do need to consider technology, but in the context of all these other dimensions. And then organizational constraints, talking about institutions and tendencies of organizations. Be honest with yourself about that. What's going to get in your way? What are the things that you can try and influence and change with creative destruction versus the ones that you're just going to have to live with? And, of course, a very practical one, how can you leverage your existing assets for APIs? And to address this, we look at things like architectural standards and guidelines at the right level, right? You want to make sure what we've seen work more effectively is more of an incentive-based approach, guidance. If you give your stakeholders, if you empower them with the right tools to do the right thing, they will, as opposed to the stick approach of being very punitive if people step out of line. Development and deployment methodology, we're seeing a lot of affinity between companies that are going on API journeys and those companies that are adopting DevOps culture and continuous delivery methodologies, as I just mentioned in the microservices piece. So, very important area of consideration. Technology roadmaps are important too, right? We know now in the world of technology today that anything that we build and deploy today probably going to be obsolete in 3 years, max, right? Like nothing's going to last more than that, or else in 3 years we'll be scorning it and saying it's legacy and how could we have ever been so stupid to do that? So, we have to, as architects, keep that obsolescence in mind, right? So and this is another reason not to be a perfectionist with things, right? It might be perfect today, but it's going to be obsolete tomorrow. So, let's get on with it and focus on delivering the goals and the tasks at hand. And so again, we have the workshops and boot camps that address these areas as well. And here's some examples of architectural topics, right? Usable, scalable, and evolvable APIs. This is a framework put together by Mike Amundsen from the team. Style selection, managing life cycles, and even getting into the areas of security concern, which is something that is independent of technology and very important. Okay, now we've been through those 3 categories, which are probably less technologically oriented, and now we get into manageability and security. And this is just as foundational as the other 3. But this is probably the area that can be best addressed by technology. So, specifically, right, manageability and security, this is the realm of API management. API management solutions. So, oftentimes people wonder, okay, how does the API Academy intersect with API management, industry-leading solutions offered by CA? This is really where we intersect. This is an important area that we see value in and definitely see API management solution as the right approach here. So, just to boil it down, right, it should be easy to see and control an API's activity. And we need to make sure that APIs only give the right data to the right consumers. And this is becoming more and more fundamentally important piece. We could look into the questions again around this. What operational metrics do we need for APIs? Business metrics, right? How do you, probably the key thing though is once you have all the data around how things are operating and business is happening, how do you use these metrics? Right? How do you use them to understand and control your business? And also, how can you feed this information back into the real-time experience of users that are actually consuming your APIs? Right? How can you get smarter about it and more dynamic about it? Right? Controlling access to APIs is important, but needs to be at the right level, right? You don't want to lock things down to the point where you actually stop people from adopting APIs, right? So finding the balance of the right level of security, right? Who are all the identities involved in APIs? How do you protect their privacy? And how do you use that information to authorize usage of your APIs? And then what are the threats? What are the new threats that you legitimately need to protect against in the world of APIs? We've seen a number of API breaches recently from companies who built mobile apps, launched APIs without thinking about the fact that they were introducing a new attack vector on the web. And in the API Academy, again, we do cover these areas and we can look at them in our workshops and boot camps. But fundamentally, this is something that needs to be addressed by technology, and the API management platform covers this as well as some of the other previous pieces we've seen. So within CA, we published this 5 Pillars of API Management paper, which I encourage you to read. Covers really the areas of importance of API management. And it covers the ones that I'm talking about here around manageability and security, but also goes back and covers things like dealing with scalability and evolvability and dealing with engagement and usability. So, definitely is an important piece, and this is where the technology fits in the overall considerations for enterprise API success. So that's a very, I would call it a brief introduction to this model because there are so many different jumping off points where we can go into more detail around all these categories. The purpose, as I said in the outset of this presentation, is to give you a full holistic survey of the enterprise API space, help guide you in looking at the areas that you need to consider and the questions that you need to ask in order to get on the right track, starting with an API program. I certainly would love to work with you on your API strategy with the API Academy, see where we can help. Hopefully this is an informative and helpful session and help stimulate some thinking on how you can apply and be successful with APIs in your own company. One last plug for our API360 Summit in Dallas. I think it would be a great event if you're able to get there. We'll be covering a lot of the ground that I touched on today, but you won't just be hearing it from me or the API Academy members. You'll be hearing it from people in the industry who are either experts like Eric on analyzing the space or actively working on their own API initiatives. So for more info on what I've covered here, I've got a number of links. Our API Academy site. We did a web API series recently with InfoQ that covers a lot of ground and even includes an interview with Roy Fielding, who I mentioned a couple of times, founder of REST. Ken Lane, who's the API evangelist, has a great link on the history of APIs if you're interested to see more about the data disruptors I mentioned. There's the Amazon book, the Everything Store, and we just recently published a guide to REST, an ebook from CA that we got the link there. So with that, I know I ate up all the time with my slides, although I'm pretty happy that I was able to put 46 slides or 40 whatever slides into an hour. I'd like to open it up at this point for questions. And I will start by going back through the chat list to see if there are some questions to address. Okay. So first question, what is the importance of API's performance? What's the best way to measure them and optimize them to ensure better performance? I like this question because I think I know how it was intended, but I think it can be interpreted in a couple of ways, right? There's the obvious performance of runtime, kind of an operational performance. So, let's look at how much traffic is going through the APIs. Let's look at the response times for the APIs. And then let's look at, how do we optimize that performance? So we can address that. And I think the way to do that, if you're, for example, if you're using our API management platform, we have built-in analytics around those pieces so that you can understand, see where the slowdowns are happening, if there's certain time intervals, if there are certain, URI paths that are slower. You need to definitely have an understanding of behind the scenes, what are all the software components involved in delivering the API, and then correlate that with the behavior you're seeing on the API. But the other thing is to measure the API's business performance, right? How do you collect information around, are you getting the right clients using your APIs? That's one way of measuring the performance, right? Are you, prioritizing the right clients for business performance? If you're using APIs for better reach, are you hitting the projected traffic volumes you need to in order to hit the business goals that you outlined in your business case for your APIs? So, like all this stuff, I'll branch off, but I think that there's a lot of things that you can do around measuring both operational and business performance. Okay, I love this question now. The next question is, the concepts you describe along the presentation seem to be for a big API project. I'm currently working in a startup. I have to build an API that will be used for our app and at least 2 big websites. Any advice? So I like this a lot because it's absolutely true. I was coming at this from the perspective of those established companies who are looking to get started on APIs. So if you're in a startup, congratulations. Obviously, you know, it's more more challenging environment. You're going to be going in a competitive space, and you need to be very, very aggressive. But you probably have a green field, right? You can start from scratch. So, you know, I think that if you already have defined who your consumers are going to be, that's a great start, right? You know that you're going to have your own application. You know you're going to have 2 big websites, right? I would say the right place to start is to really drill down on the use cases for those. Take them one consumer at a time. You know, understand exactly what you need to do for your app, exactly what each website does, and then from that point, look for the commonalities and look for the ways that you can design the API to service all 3 of them in the most optimized way. This is definitely an area where, you know, we could help out with a workshop to go through all the other categories. I think it would be interesting to see, you know, what are the points of extensibility around your API? Are you going to be, do you already have in mind areas of growth that you want to go on? Do you know who are new consumers that are going to be coming after those first 3? Who are going, you know, what are going to be some other business areas that you might expand on? But as I said, the most concrete place to start is just to absolutely get the use cases drawn out for the 3 consumers that you have, focus on them one at a time, and then look for the commonalities. Going down to the Q&A as well, we've got some questions here. I'm going to follow up on the Williams question afterwards. I think he had to drop off. From a program ownership perspective, whom within the company do you recommend should own the API product? And should they also own the developer program? This is a great question. Thanks, Mark. So we're seeing a popular model come up now where a lot of companies, especially established enterprises, are forming these digital departments, and to the point of appointing a chief digital officer, right? So the CDO might be the right owner of the API program, but the APIs themselves will probably warrant their own API product managers. And one of the things that we're always recommending is to manage each API as a product. So it's important to have a business owner because it's important to keep the business pieces front and center. And so I think it definitely makes sense to have a developer program owned on the business side, and it could be that you want to have somebody, it depends on the size of the company, you could want one person to have developer program responsibility across the organization, or it might make sense for each API product manager to own their own developer program per se. But the key is that ownership should reside in the business side of your organization. And you know, just one more thing on those digital departments, they seem to be kind of a mashup of business and technology people, but with reporting into the business side. So that's probably the most popular model that we're seeing. I think the key thing is just to establish singular ownership. Ownership by committee is something that usually breaks down quickly. All right, I've gone 5 minutes over on our allotted time, and really appreciate your patience and staying with it. A lot to cover. Definitely hope you can make our Dallas session, and if not, I definitely look forward to interacting with you in the future and to our next webinar. Thanks very much.